Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Project Flux podcast. Today we have an interview with Richard Bendall-Jones from nPlan. He's the product management and risk engineer at nPlan. He's had a wide-ranging career with a big stint at Network Rail, where he ended up as risk and value manager and has been at nPlan since November 2021. So he's going to talk to us a bit about his experience, nPlan's experience, and where he thinks the future of artificial intelligence in project delivery is going. Before that, I just want to pick up on a few of the key topics from the newsletter. I am Yoshi-less this week because he's on another holiday. So I'm just going to sort of skim through some of the big news items rather than discuss them in depth before we go to the interview with Richard. If you want to read up about them in more detail, then as I always say, please subscribe to the Project Flux newsletter. I'd also like to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Construct AI, and you can click through on the show notes to have a trial of Construct AI, and also that is on the newsletter. We've been using it for some time, and it's now one of the pinned tabs to my browser because I use it so often, so I thoroughly encourage everyone to have a look at that. So the big news that we picked up on this week was a study from Microsoft and LinkedIn's 2024 Work Trend Index, which they do, I think it's annually. And there's a kind of divergent stats in there. One which was around 75% of knowledge workers now use AI, and then 78% of them bring in their own AI to work. So if you might remember the bring your own device craze back in, I guess it was sort of the early 2000s, now we've got this phrase being bandied about called bring your own AI, or BYOAI. So get used to that. And it's mixed with dangers, really, because if you're bringing your own AI and you're using your own AI, i.e. your own ChatGPT subscription or Claude subscription, then you're not necessarily got all the safety features that your organization might have. So it's going to be interesting to see how this emerges over time. I think if you do use your own AI, the same kind of common sense approach has to take place, which is don't do anything stupid, don't do anything that you wouldn't do under your company requirements. And, you know, it's not a replacement for your professional competence. And that's what I always say to people, you know, you can't sort of blame it on AI if it's hallucinating and it comes up with something to say, well, that's what the AI came up with, I think is dodgy ground. So you still got to have that bookending approach that we talked about with Cecilia a couple of podcasts back, which is human at the beginning, rhythm in the middle, and human at the end. The other interesting thing about that report was 71% of executives say they prefer hiring individuals with AI expertise, which really shows how important these skills are becoming. That doesn't mean people need to become coders, as we always say, or even kind of AI experts, but they just got to have the skills. So the reason why we do this podcast, as we always say, is to kind of bring that encouragement to people that this is not anything to be scared of. This is something that you can learn yourself in your own time, and then you can bring those skills into the workplace. And this study from Microsoft and LinkedIn kind of backs that up. So well worth having a read of that. In the tech section, there's lots of rumors going on about OpenAI and their new models. Is it going to be GPT-5? Is it a kind of upgrade to GPT-4? But the interesting thing, or rumors that are coming out over the past week, is that OpenAI is looking at premium subscription models for this new model, whatever it may be. Maybe it's Strawberry. And if rumors are to be believed, they're saying prices reaching $2,000 per month for these premium models. So that obviously means there's a lot going on in the background with these models, a lot of compute power, and they need to find a way of recouping it. But I think what's going to end up happening is probably a two-tier system where they'll still have the free tools like the GPT-4o, and then these kind of enterprise tools will be at this higher price. I can't see it being $2,000 per month because I think that's just going to be prohibitive, you know, to a lot of SMEs, and we don't want to get to the point where it's just the big companies that can afford the luxury of utilizing AI. But those are the rumors, and you can read up all about it. But what I would be very concerned about, I guess, is if we end up with a tier which is only, if we get to this next level of AI power, which is this level 2 that we've discussed about, which is PhD level reasoning, I'll be very concerned if only people who can pay that much get access to that, because especially if it's coming from OpenAI. I mean, the clue was in the title, it's meant to be an open source. I know that's not the way it's worked out. But I think this will just drive more separation between the big players, and it'll be interesting to see Meta's response to that, who are putting everything behind open source models. So maybe it's just a rumor, but it's worth reading up about. And again, that is in the newsletter, along with lots of other tech stories that you can read up about, including NVIDIA's stock falls, stuff about Midjourney getting into hardware, lots around Elon Musk's Colossus that he's building, that's going to power his Grok 3 model. There's plenty going on in the tech world. In the projects world, there was a piece in, I can't remember which publication it was actually. It was Built Worlds, which I follow, which is well worth a follow, where they looked at something called physical AI. Now, physical AI is effectively what we've been talking about quite a lot, which is the combination of robotics and AI, and how that's going to start redefining project delivery over the next decade or so, as we see more and more machines that can perceive, manipulate, operate autonomously in these real-world environments. So the tech is there now, effectively. If not there right now, it will be within the next year or so, and then it's going to be about affordability. So there's quite a nice piece about that that's well worth reading about, and it is going to impact the way that we can imagine project delivery, especially when we look at the productivity stats that have always been a concern in project delivery. Being able to utilize this physical AI or robotics with AI on sites, whether that's a construction site or a nuclear site or an infrastructure site, is massively going to help. And then there's some other project news around Klarna. Some of you may be familiar with the Klarna app for purchasing. They're saying that their AI assistant is going to handle 2/3 of customer services, and they've started making redundancies. Is this a sign of things to come? That was clearly going to be the first use case that was going to be disrupted, and that's happening there. The other thing on projects to be aware of was the Volkswagen rolled out AI assistants in their cars powered by ChatGPT. And I had a drive yesterday, and I was thinking about this. At the moment, the kind of Siri powered or automation is very basic in cars, isn't it? Asking you to play a song or turn a radio station on. I think it's not going to be long before the next iteration is you're having conversations with your AI in the car about all kinds of things. And as autonomous vehicles become more and more prevalent, there's going to be a chance to actually, do work and alongside your AI assistant. So that's starting to be rolled out with Volkswagen. So keep your eyes out for that. In the productivity news, there was a brilliant piece. I'm not going to talk too much about this. All I would do is encourage you to go and read it, because it's from Yuval Noah Harari, who some of you may be aware of from his Homo Sapiens book. Brilliant writer, really, really easy to understand. And he wrote a piece around advanced AI systems, how they could manipulate human emotions, creating this kind of fake relationship, and whether that's a threat to democracy, which is obviously very timely with the US election going on at the moment and what have you. So rather than go through that in a lot of detail, I would just think you should read his opinion piece, which you can find through the newsletter. And really, how is that ethical integration or consideration going to be integrated into business as AI becomes more and more prevalent? In terms of events, there's an AI event in London with Samsung on the 14th of September at 6:30, and we've got a link to a competition in the newsletter, so you can bag yourself a couple of tickets by clicking on the link. It looks like a fantastic event with Samsung, so please go and have a look at that. I'm also very aware that the Apple event happened after our newsletter was published, so we're going to cover that next week. So I'm going to keep my powder dry on that one of my opinions around the Apple event, but do tune in next week to find out a bit more about what Apple unleashed and what that means for AI in project delivery. So that's really everything I wanted to cover. So without any further ado, I will now go on to the discussion with Richard. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show, Richard. Thank you for agreeing to come and speak to us.
Thanks for having me.
And Yoshi is joining us today, all the way from Mauritius, which is not at all making us jealous. Yes.
I'm really excited for this one.
Richard, if you don't mind, if we could just start with a bit about you and your career. It looks like you've had a really exciting career journey from project management to risk management and then on to AI. What led you to focus on an AI-driven risk management platform at nPlan? And how has your previous experience influenced your work?
Yeah, so I started off as a project manager in UK infrastructure. When I was a project manager, I used to really like the risk stuff. I always found it really interesting. So it was kind of a logical career step for me. And when I was doing it, it's always a good mindset for a risk manager to be a healthy skeptic. And over the years, I was aware of the tools and techniques I was using that it was, very much human driven, things like that. And it occurred to me that we're very subject to bias in the risk identification and analysis steps. And I thought I developed quite a strong professional interest in like that intersection between risk and data. And this was, 5-10 years ago, we were in the realm of talking about predictive analytics, big data, things like that. And then I saw that there were companies who were starting to harness this and use it as their core value proposition. So I made the jump to, ironically, a bit of a risky jump over to nPlan, and I began off in the client team there, and I've moved over to product management, which means I help decide what goes into our products and then how it's best for us to build it. So quite often when we talk about these technologies, we talk about what does the future look like, and I guess I wanted to be part of that.
Yeah, well, it's you certainly jumped into it at the right time. And I think as a strategic kind of career move, you must be looking back now and thinking, wow, okay, I couldn't have imagined just how much into the public consciousness AI would be. And now it's the thing everyone's talking about, right?
Yeah. I mean, we've really seen an explosion, particularly over the last 2 years, and the advent of large language models and the public profile of things like ChatGPT have really pushed that. Well, it really accelerated it about 2 years ago, that kind of public consciousness of these technologies and how we can feed into people's lives, because people have used like machine learning models in their lives, when it comes to Spotify algorithms or Google Maps or something like that. But because there's that kind of active element to things like ChatGPT, I think it's changed people's relationships with it.
Yeah, I think it was a huge milestone. It was the first time that I've seen people, well, I'd say people who weren't in the AI space, starting to talk about it. You've got a major milestone on your hands when you're talking to your mum and dad about these things, right?
Yeah.
And that was the acid test for me when my mum said, "What's this Chat GPT?" I thought, okay, this thing's happening. So it is really exciting. I was interested in what you said about that jump though from project management to risk management and that identification with the inherent bias within a lot of project data. And we're going to talk about this a lot more as we go through the interview, but there's bias and then there's noise, two slightly different things, but two major issues that impact how useful construction data can be. How has that developed over the time that you've joined nPlan, do you think?
Yeah, so I think that obviously there is a difference between bias and noise, and being able to drive data-driven technologies really helps with that noise element, because the capability of these technologies has really accelerated, particularly over the last 5 years. But also because, if I look at machine learning as a methodology, it's performance driven. So it seeks to optimize beyond the noise. So, again, when you're talking about machine learning, and in this example, predictive machine learning, then you are looking at large amounts of data, and often we say the larger the better, and that helps to understand, is an anomaly really an anomaly? Is it noise? That kind of things. Being able to capture, processing speed that we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years, and the data sets that we're able to kind of work with, that's enabled us to kind of help deal with the noise issue. Now, the bias issue is slightly more complex, I would say, because it's where humans come in essentially. And
Yeah.
some of that is unconscious bias and some of it is quite conscious bias. So, you can use terms if you want to be a bit more cynical, like the strategic misrepresentation of projects.
Yeah.
So so how do I get my project green lit? Because when it's green lit, then there's a big sunk cost there, so the project tends to roll on. But also there's people who are genuinely trying to do their best job. Humans aren't able to process in their brains the entire data of a complex project. So part of it is about helping people with that as well.
Yeah, and I remember reading, I can't remember which book it was or study, but it mentioned that even the most basic algorithm can be more reliable than the human's kind of gut instinct. And we think our gut instinct is so valuable because, we have that kind of ego, I suppose, which goes with it. But actually, we are massively flawed when it comes to processing large amounts of data, which kind of leads me to my next question. You mentioned that, the more data, the better. But is it more data or better quality data? What's more important for
I don't think
good algorithms?
I don't think it's binary actually, because as long as you're not dealing with an entire mountain of bad data, what you can do is identify trends within that data, and therefore you become better at identifying in this haystack which elements of that data aren't quite so great. And so what I would say is with these algorithms, bigger is, safety in numbers is the term I use with our clients. But you do always have to be aware that there is that challenge of how would we put it? Like, the opportunity, the possibility of degrading that quality somehow. So, as long as this stuff is kind of more in the minority than the majority, it's not too much of an issue because, as I say, machine learning algorithms can optimize to the majority of the data set and work out by performance-led indicators what is less appropriate and what makes the algorithm less good at predicting. So I think it's a bit of both. Obviously, you shouldn't go all in on one and not on the other. And, when you're dealing with large data sets, there's always going to be some quality issues, that would,
Mm-hmm.
people who work in data management would agree with that. And it's about managing that in an appropriate way. And part of
So
the performance-driven element of machine learning helps counter that.
when you look at the trends with the big data that you see, Richard, are there things that surprise you when you look at that data when you come to analyze it, having the experience that you've had?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, and I talked to some of our clients about this. So at nPlan, we deal with schedule data primarily. We deal with cost data as well, but our bread and butter at the moment is about schedules. So if you're someone who works with P6, when you're entering a activity in a schedule and link it up to things, you're actually inputting potentially up to 250 parameters. And the process in machine learning is by training an algorithm, a model on this data set, you work out which parameters are the best indicators for predicting. And some of these are really obvious ones, like the plan duration is a good indicator. The description of the activity, if you're able to interpret that, that's really good. But there are some that are unusual that you wouldn't expect. So what we found in our data set is projects are less productive on a Monday, which I
I
think is
wonder
really.
why that is.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
It kind
interesting.
of
Yeah.
makes sense, but you wouldn't expect an algorithm to pick that up, and it looks at it all and goes, actually, we kind of cave in a bit on a Monday, especially if we've been, it makes sense if we've been out building at the weekend. People might have Monday off as a rest day, something like that. So you do see really interesting things like that. And we did a paper a couple of years ago, I think it's back into 21, early 22, where we looked at actualized project outcomes before and after COVID. And not surprisingly, during COVID, projects became less productive, but we're actually able to define to what extent and why. If you remember, just after, maybe the first few waves of COVID, we started to see inflation occurring in the construction industry. I'm not sure if you remember, but
Yes,
the
yes.
inflation curve started first in construction, and it tended to be around steel, about aggregates and things like that. Things
That
that
was
generally,
being able to get the materials in. There was all
yeah,
kind of problems, wasn't there?
yeah, and that was borne out in the data, which was really interesting. So there's a few things you see that there's a really interesting point about whether it's counterintuitive or not, because it's proven in the data that these things happen, and it's just us as humans who find it counterintuitive because of the heuristics, because we can't process all this data. So it's interesting our interaction with these kind of data outputs.
Yeah, very
Yeah,
good.
cool.
Can I ask a quick question about nPlan then? So, if you could give us like a potted history of the story of nPlan and what were the key challenges that it's actually setting out to solve, and have those challenges evolved, I guess?
Yeah, so our founders, Dev and Alan, met at kind of a startup incubator, and Dev's a former project manager, and he always felt that his job would have been made easier, or he would have avoided more project blowouts if he had more data at his fingertips. Alan, who comes from a technical background, was like, yeah, we can do that, just need the data. So the early iterations of nPlan were starting to build up this data set and working out how we can forecast against that. And that got a lot of attention. And we realized really soon people were willing to pay for it, which is a great proof of concept.
That's a good sign, yes.
So we did a lot of learning, and we were able to attract a Series A a few years ago. And what that means is we were able to invest more money in our technologies and our infrastructure. And we're able to test those use cases with our clients to say, we ask our clients, what is it that you need to do? And the more clients you work with, the more patterns you can identify. And
Yeah.
that's meant that we've been able to build a product platform where users can serve themselves. And that's kind of where we're at the moment. We've identified these kinds of use cases. We've identified how we could do them in a new way. I'm often quoting Henry Ford, who never actually said if I asked people what they wanted, they'd ask for a faster horse. So definitely not in the business. Henry Ford never said that, but
I would claim that quote. It's quite a good quote. If I was
yeah,
Henry Ford, I'd take that.
Bit late.
and it's kind of like how I explain what I do to my colleagues, because I'm not in the business of creating faster horses. I'm trying to create the Ford Model T and like change things,
Yeah.
And so it's like learning what people need to do, and then working out, is there a better way of doing it? And yeah, that's kind of where we're at the moment. We're working with those clients, understanding these new use cases, and fundamentally, it's all about helping them to achieve their objectives. Our objectives tend to be helping people with forecasting, but there is a bit of an intersection there, because once you understand how you can forecast on things, you can then understand what parts of projects people need to spend focus and attention on, and that's where you can move out of the project controls domain and then into other disciplines, whether that's planning, whether that's project management, because they're all one team with the same objective, right? To deliver a project on time, on budget, scope, that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a bit of a potted history of nPlan, I suppose.
So just on that then, Richard, because I know you mentioned at the start, and Alan going to recognise the need to have to capture a lot of data. And one thing that whenever I look back at nPlan, you kind of pride yourselves on the amount of data, kind of the size of the training data set that you have in the back end, right? I think it's like 750,000 or something. So there's a lot of data points that are there. Predominantly, I'm assuming that's associated with risk and schedule data. So do you guys intend to kind of move to kind of cost prediction at some point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it makes absolute sense to do that for a few reasons. Firstly, people ask us a lot, and it makes sense why people ask us a lot about that. But also, they ask a lot about it because they are two key drivers and functions of projects, time and cost. Of course, we have quality, scope, safety, those kind of tertiary elements. but ultimately it's about time and cost. A great idea. Some things are harder, more easily said than done, shall we say. It's definitely something that I keep banging the drum on, and at the moment trying to find the best solution for it, because one thing that I'm really proud of at nPlan is we could throw out quite a blasé, half-baked idea, but we wouldn't be happy with that. So I'd rather us work out an absolute killer methodology to this, which is data-driven, which aligns with our schedule proposition. But yeah,
So
absolutely something I'm looking at.
it's a watch this space, is it?
Mhm.
And from someone, I mean, I've got a QS background myself, so it's cost estimation is something which is close to my heart. And you're right, it's a tough nut not to crack. But I think because they're so interlinked, time drives the cost. If you've cracked the time side of things and the scheduled side of things, you're going to be halfway there to the cost because it's so dependent on the time. So that's going to be extremely interesting to see the evolution. And of course, I was at your latest event online, and to see some of the fantastic features that come out and the continued rollout of things like Barry, your large language model, is always exciting. But could I ask you about some of the challenges? Because I know it's also not always easy. We're all in this space and we know the advantages, but I suppose the challenges of designing AI-driven tools for industries like construction and project delivery, where users are not only not familiar with AI, but also can be quite resistant to AI.
Yeah, I think the first point I'd start, and I think you've summarized it pretty well, to be honest, James. First for me is the familiarity, because a lot of project processes and methodologies have remained broadly the same for a very long time. I think maybe, from a controls environment, the biggest change was critical path method, which is the early 60s. And what's improved is processing speed, is what I would say. We started to get early quantitative risk assessments in the early 80s, only because computers could then do it. I wouldn't fancy doing a Monte Carlo by hand. And as
It's a few months of your life, wouldn't it?
yeah. Well, I mean, some people would enjoy it, I'm sure. And then as computers got faster, you've been able to do more complex stuff in Excel, and finally we've been getting, we're able to do, really high intensity analysis. And also that kind of opens the door to technologies like nPlan, where there's a lot of computing power. And all these concepts are, in one way evolutionary in terms of, hey, we've made Windows faster or something like that. But then to introduce artificial intelligence technologies, it's like a paradigm shift, because if you're doing a spreadsheet in Windows 98 or something like that, you have control over everything. You can explain everything. With AI, that's starting to change the conversation, because it's saying, you know what? You might not be able to process all this stuff because you're amazing, but this stuff's horrendously complex. So let us do some of the maths for you. And that's a very unusual dynamic. Particularly, and I've been there myself, your competence is very closely linked to your ego and your idea of self-worth. And people can find that not intimidating, but maybe frustrating to a certain extent, that some algorithm thinks, and people can perceive it like that, it can do my job better. Whereas really, and I mean this, completely genuinely, it's there to make people better at their jobs, and be able to do stuff more effectively. So I don't think we're fully there in terms of people understanding that. And I try, as we all do, we try to do a lot of hearts and minds stuff in the industry to kind of help people along that journey. We're definitely not there. So that's kind of the familiarity element. But I also touched on the behavioural dynamic there, and that's where these things will always become complex, because you can design something in quite a rigid way. It's engineering, essentially. The moment it touches a parallel system that is human, then it can explode into all different kinds of use cases, or champions, detractors, interest points, disinterest points. And that's where it gets really interesting. And that's why my role as a product manager is really fascinating because you can have all the hypotheses in the world, and I've had a few, and I've been roundly schooled in that it has been thoroughly incorrect, and that comes back to kind of not just AI as a new discipline, but people interacting with AI as well. So, particularly in the construction industry, I read somewhere that I forget what it was, but like with new products, you have to cross the chasm from early adopters into mass adoption. But in the construction industry, you have to do it twice because you have to do all the winning of hearts and minds, and you know, kind of testing stuff in parallel and things like that. And then you need to like cross the chasm into mass adoption. So it in some respects, it's doubly
Yeah,
challenging
well, it's
in the
probably triple because then you've got the fragmentation issue as well. The fact that
yeah,
you've
true.
got to hit different parts of the supply chain. But yeah, I think it's not an easy industry, and it still amazes me how much of that hearts and minds still has to be done, which is partly why we do this podcast, right, and the newsletter, because we do realise that that's still an issue. Yoshi, I think you had a question, did you?
Yeah, because something you said, Richard, kind of latched onto. You mentioned, the dynamic between, AI machines and humans will change, as we move forward. And you kind of touched on the ego. And just looking at your career, someone coming from project management and risk engineering, et cetera, what was your aha moment when you realized, humans might not be in the driving seat in the future? And how did you kind of feel when you thought, okay,
Yeah, so I think my reflection was humans need to make decisions on projects. And I think there's always going to be that human in the loop element of decision making on projects. Because if you take that out, that's where it all starts getting sci-fi and robots building hospitals without asking us and things like that. My kind of, shall we say, baseline was that the humans are always going to be involved with this process because, okay, you get the data and then you choose what to do with it. Where I found the challenge was that I think it's at the start of The Black Swan by Taleb, actually. There's like a quiz with some university students, and they're really crap at estimating stuff. So, like, humans are really bad at estimating stuff generally, but they're also very bad at estimating how bad they are at estimating as well. So that that kind of links into you're telling me I'm not very good at estimating. That's a surprise to me. So for me, sitting in workshops and talking with stakeholders, and I'm going to talk about the unconscious bias here. People are honestly trying their best, but they don't have access to all the data in a structured way. And if they do have access to some data, it can be weighted incorrectly. So if we're talking about proximity bias, a piece of plant blows up on you the weekend before, you're going to be more attuned to that risk than, say, something else that can catch you unawares. And that kind of comes back to my earlier point about things seeming counterintuitive, because maybe they only seem counterintuitive because you haven't had to think about it before, or it's not happened in a while, but actually the data is showing something different. So to answer your question more directly, I saw how people interacted with traditional risk processes, and it just felt like we were asking humans to do something that really a computer would be able to help with, and then that would help us. Because decision making on projects is always complex, but as long as we can be confident that we have the best information possible, then we maximize our chances of making the right decisions. So hopefully that answers the question.
cool.
If I could move on to a question, a bit of a devil's advocate question, if you like, Richard, but one of the big kind of pushbacks I get from people around AI is that the fear that it's kind of oversimplifying what are inherently complex decision-making exercises. So how do you ensure that nPlan's tools complement human expertise without replacing it? We talked last week to Cecilia Longstrom about the study that the London Property Alliance did, and she talked really eloquently about the bookmark, the bookmark at the book ending, where you've got a human at the beginning of the process, algorithm, and then human at the end of the process. Is that something that you prescribe to with what you're building with nPlan?
So yes and no. I think your original point about AI perhaps oversimplifying the complex is to a certain extent a valid one, because people have a lot of field expertise that a algorithm cannot understand necessarily. An algorithm does not sit in the project office and understand who makes a good cup of tea. And, the silly example, but all those minute project interactions that enable someone to build up a mental model
Yeah,
of their
and
project.
the body language and stuff like that algorithms can't yet detect.
So I think actually the biggest problem with, shall we say, the AI hype train is it can get translated into AI being a panacea, and it absolutely isn't. So one thing that, things like machine learning is good at is like providing a range of outcomes and a range of, say, project futures, leaves the door open for, and I think is a really powerful thing, is to introduce that human earlier on in the loop to say, okay, well, why do you think this is? And you can use these technologies now, they're getting better. They used to be not so great at it, getting better at saying why, what is the reasoning behind these outputs? And, we've been working on some ways, to do that, because quite often you can imagine our clients or any vendor in this space will say, that's great, but why? And that's always been a
Like,
challenge. I think we're getting better at that. So you can actually insert that at the front of, that process of interacting. Well, the inputs, I suppose, not just the results of it. To say, what do you think are potential causes of the delay in a project? So quite often people will say, is this oversimplifying it? And actually, that's a really important user interface and user experience point, because there's a bit of a balancing act, because people often want their lives to be quicker and easier. And if you do that, that can give the impression of oversimplifying things. Whereas if you overcomplicate things, you might not even get that user, because they're like, oh no, it's too
It's a fine
technical.
line, isn't it? It
Yeah,
is a
so
very
that
fine
that
line.
kind of balance, and it's like, how do you cater for both? I mean, they're not two discrete sets; it's a spectrum, right? But how do you deal for both ends of that spectrum in the way that switches neither of them off? So I think part of it is there's a lot of complexity under the hood that people don't get exposed to, and that can create the veneer of simplicity.
Richard, one thing you mentioned earlier on, right at the start of the podcast, was the Monday thing. So you said, the AI can detect on Mondays people are less productive. And we know that because, Monday morning is a very stressful time. We've got the Sunday blues, etc., etc. Do you think there'll be a point in time where AI will be able to understand that context and, provide that context?
Well, I would say it already can, because we're able to understand these rules, and these rules are essentially what formulates a model. So we could, if we wanted to, we could provide that as an insight, say, hey,
Right.
you might be less productive on every Monday in this project. And you can surface that kind of stuff. But the next step has to be, well, okay, that's great, but what do I do with that? What, you stop people going out partying at the weekends? Or, so there's one thing about being able to show stuff that's interesting, and another thing that says, actually, can I do something about it? Because, like, in my role as a risk manager over the years, the one phrase that particularly wound me up was, that is interesting, because it sounds like, yeah, that's cool. I don't plan to do anything with it. So
Stick it on the risk register and forget it ever happened.
exactly, yeah, we'll use it if we're putting in a change paper at some point.
Well, that's what everyone did with COVID or the pandemic, wasn't it? Oh, yeah. Forget the trends that these things happen once every sort of generation. And we're due one. We'll just totally ignore that fact. So it's human nature, unfortunately, which is where I think AI, the power of AI is in that it overcomes some of those human flaws, whether that be bias, whether that be gut instincts, whether that be proximity by all those things. But Richard, thank you so much for agreeing to come on. For the listeners' sake, how can people find out more about him?
Yeah, so we've got a website which is www.nplan.io. You can find out about our products there. We have some free trials. So we've got free trials for a couple of products. One's called Insights Pro, which focuses on large complex projects and analysis and insights to do with that. We also have a trial of auto reports where you can upload some of your files that you're comfortable uploading and create reports based on that. We've got some contact details. If you're interested and want to drop me a line, my email address is richard@nplan.io. I'll probably put this in the comments below. I'm always up for a chat with my fellow practitioners. And yeah, keep an eye on LinkedIn because every day the event you're talking about, James, comes around twice a year. It's always quite exciting. It's a good thought provoker, I think. Really exciting as well.
It's always a good day, and the way that you actually put it on and the hype you build up around it's really, really good. And talking from recording being done on the same day as the Apple launch, I think you've taken a few cues from those guys in the way
No,
that you
I think it's the other way around.
Obviously, yeah. Everything they know is down to you. But in terms of all those links and your email, those will all be on the show notes for everyone as well, so you can click straight through. But do feel free to reach out to Richard. So any final words from you, Richard, or anything else you'd like to say that you haven't managed to cover in the podcast so far?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Firstly, I'm a really strong champion that project management should be for all, and I try really hard to be an ally in that space. And actually, one thing that maybe we don't talk about as much in the AI space is actually how these technologies can become levelers of the playing field. So when I was doing research with project managers and things like that and looking at potential features, something that came up quite regularly, especially with generative AI, was like, oh, I could give this to my junior project manager to learn how to build a bridge or what is risky about a bridge or something like that. So that means like where we might have come from a world where we struggled to get time with a grumpy, overworked senior engineer, that's much more accessible now and appropriate to the cultural setting that it's in. So change on construction, on infrastructure projects is always difficult, but there's benefits there. It will be worth the grind, and it'll open the door for a lot more people. And that is something I'm really excited about.
Excellent. Well, that's a really positive note to end it on. So thank you once again, Richard. We do hope you'll come back onto the show, maybe after the next AI day to let us know the latest developments in nPlan, particularly when you're going to drop that big cost module, which I'm sure is coming at some point.
Yeah, watch this space.
Watch this space. Absolutely. Well, listen, thank you so much, Richard, and we'll look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Just want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Construct AI. For anyone interested in looking at Construct AI, the link's in our show notes. There's a free tier that you can play around with. Yoshi and I have been using it for a good year since it was originally launched, and we get a huge amount of value out of it. So I thoroughly encourage everyone to go onto the Construct AI site and have a play around.
Cool. And guys, before we sign off, please don't forget to share, follow, and like all of our stuff. So that helps us to engage with you and understand a bit more about what you want so we can bring it to your doorstep as early as possible.